everyone, I'm Miss Mary Beth. I'm the Youth Services Librarian at Ingalls Memorial Library in Ringe, and I'm here today for Armchair Adventures. And that's our series where every day I read a little bit of a book to you, and eventually we finish a whole book together. And the book we're reading right now is The Princess and the Goblin, and it was written by George MacDonald, and it was recommended to me by a friend, and I'm enjoying it so far. It was written in 1870, and the author wrote it as if he was speaking directly to children, so when he narrates, the narrator uses I a lot, and he adds his own opinions, which makes it kind of interesting. I like it so far. And what we've read is that this little girl, this princess Irene, she lives in a farm castle in the mountains with her nurse, Ludi, and one day she goes exploring in the house, and she goes all the way up, and she finds that there's a very, very old lady who lives there, who has the same name as her, and who says she's her great-great-great-grandmother. Irene eventually tries to go back, but she can't find her again. But the grandmother's very nice. And then the next day, Ludi, the nurse, and Irene go outside and they go exploring a little bit, but they're out after dark. And we know, and the nurse knows, and everybody in the village knows that the princess cannot go out after dark. Do you know why she can't go out after dark? Do we remember? Because of the goblins. The goblins used to live above ground, but the king kind of banished them from the land for some reason that we don't really know. But instead of leaving the country, they just went below the ground. And now they kind of want revenge on the princess, any descendant of that king long, long ago who banished them. So Irene and her nurse meet this boy Curdy, and he helps them get home. He knows that if he sings really loudly, the goblins won't come. So they get home, and that's Irene's first encounter with the goblins. She had no idea they existed. She was never out after dark. So let's see what happens in the next chapter. It's called The Mines, Chapter 7. Curdy went home whistling. He resolved to say nothing about the princess for fear of getting the nurse into trouble, for while he enjoyed teasing her because of her absurdity, Curdy was careful not to do the nurse any harm. He saw no more of the goblins, and he was soon fast asleep in his bed. He woke in the middle of the night, and he thought he heard curious noises outside. He sat up and listened. Then he got up, and, opening the door very quietly, he went out. When he peeped around the corner, he saw, under his own window, a group of stumpy creatures, whom he at once recognized by their shape. Hardly, however, had he begun his 1, 2, 3 song, when they broke asunder, scurried away, and were out of sight. He returned laughing, got into bed again, and was fast asleep in a moment. Reflecting a little over the matter in the morning, he came to the conclusion that, as nothing of the kind had ever happened before, they must be annoyed with him for interfering to protect the princess. By the time he was dressed, however, he was thinking of something quite different, for he did not value the enmity of the goblins in the least. As soon as they had had breakfast, he set off with his father for the mine. They entered the hill by a natural opening under a huge rock, where a little stream rushed out. They followed its course for a few yards, when the passage took a turn and sloped steeply into the heart of the hill, with many angles and windings and branchings off, and sometimes with steps where it came upon a natural gulf. It led them deep into the hill before they arrived at the place where they were at present digging out the precious ore. This was of various kinds, for the mountain was very rich in the better sorts of metals. With flint and steel and tinderbox, they lighted their lamps, then fixed them on their heads, and were soon hard at work with their pickaxes and shovels and hammers. Father and son were at work near each other, but not in the same gang. The passages out of which the ore was dug, they called gangs. For when the lode, or vein of ore, was small, one miner would have to dig away alone in the passage no bigger than gave him just room to work. Sometimes he had to work in uncomfortable and cramped positions. If the miners stopped for a moment, they could hear everywhere around them, some nearer, some farther off, the sounds of their companions burrowing away in all directions in the inside of the great mountain, some boring holes in the rock in order to blow it up with gunpowder, others shoveling the broken ore into baskets to be carried into the mouth of the mine, others hitting away with their pickaxes. Sometimes, if the miner was in a very lonely part, he would only hear a tap-tapping, no louder than that of a woodpecker, for the sound would come from a great distance off through solid mountain rock. The work was hard at best, for it was very warm underground, but it was not particularly unpleasant. And some of the miners, when they wanted to earn a little more money for a particular purpose, would stop behind the rest and work all night. You could not tell night from day down there, except for feeling tired and sleepy, for no light of the sun ever came into those gloomy regions. Some who had thus remained behind during the night, although they were certain there were none of their companions at work, would declare the next morning that they heard, every time they halted for a moment to take breath, a tapping all about them, as if the mountain were then more full of miners than ever it was during the day. And some, in consequence, would never stay overnight, for they all knew those were the sounds of the goblins. They worked only at night, for the miners' night was the goblins' day. So you know what that's called? They nocturnal. Indeed, the greater number of the miners were afraid of the goblins, for there were strange stories well known amongst them of the treatment some had received whom the goblins had surprised at their work during the night. The more courageous of them, however, amongst them Peter Peterson and his son Curdy, who in this took after his father, had stayed in the mine all night again and again. And although they had several times encountered a few stray goblins, they had never yet failed in driving them away. As I have indicated already, the chief defense against them was verse, for they hated verse of every kind, and sometimes they could not endure it all. I suspect they could not make any verses themselves, and that's why they disliked the song so much. At all events, those who were most afraid of them were not those who could either make verses themselves, nor remember the verses that other people made for them, while those who were never afraid of the goblins were those who could make songs for themselves. For, although there were certain old rhymes which were very effectual, yet it was well known that a new rhyme, if of the right sort, was even more distasteful to them, and therefore more effectual in putting them to flight. Perhaps my readers may be wondering what the goblins could be about, working all night long, seeing that they never carried up the ore and sold it. But when I have informed them concerning what Curdy learned the very next night, they will be able to understand. Are you ready? For Curdy had determined, if his father would permit him, to remain there alone this night, and that was for 2 reasons. First, he wanted to get extra wages that he might buy a very warm red petticoat for his mother, who had begun to complain of the cold of the mountain air sooner than usual this autumn. And second, he had just a faint hope of finding out what the goblins were about under his window the night before. When he told his father he was going to stay overnight, his father made no objection, for he had great confidence in his boy's courage and resources. "I'm sorry I can't stay with you," said Peter, "but I want to go and pay the parson a visit this evening, and besides, I've had a bit of a headache all day." "I'm sorry for that, father," said Curdy. "Oh, it's not much. You'll be sure to take care of yourself, won't you?" "Yes, father, I will. I'll keep a sharp lookout, I promise you." Curdy was the only one who remained in the mine. About 6 o'clock the rest went away, everyone bidding him good night, and telling him to take good care of himself, for he was a great favorite with them all. "Don't forget your rhymes," said one. "No, no," answered Curdy. "It's no matter if he does," said another, "for he'll only have to make up a new one." "Yes, but he mightn't be able to make it up fast enough," said another. "And while it was cooking in his head, they might take a mean advantage of it, and the goblins might set upon him." "Don't worry, I'll do my best," said Curdy. "I'm not afraid." "We all know that," they answered, and they left. That was the end of Chapter 7. Chapter 8 is called The Goblins. For some time, Curdy worked away briskly, throwing all the ore he had disengaged on one side behind him, to be ready for carrying out in the morning. He had heard a good deal of goblin tapping, but it all sounded far away in the hill, and he paid it little heed. Towards midnight he began to feel rather hungry, so he dropped his pickaxe, got a lump of bread, which in the morning he had laid in a damp hole in the rock, and sat down on a heap of ore, and he ate his supper. Then he leaned back for 5 minutes' rest before beginning his work again, and he laid his head against the rock. He had not kept the position for 1 minute when he heard something which made him sharpen his ears. It sounded like a voice inside the rock. After a while he heard it again. It was a goblin voice. There could be no doubt about that. And this time he could make out the words. "Hadn't we better be moving?" it said. A rougher and deeper voice replied. "There's no hurry. That wretched little mole won't be through tonight, if he worked ever so hard. He's not by any means at the thinnest place." "But do you still think the load comes through into our house?" said the first voice. "Yes, but a good bit farther on than he has got to yet. If he had struck a stroke more to the side than just here," said the goblin, tapping the very stone, it seemed to Curdy, against which his head lay, "he would have been through, but he's a couple of yards past it now, and if you follow the load it will be a week before it leads him in. You'll see it back there a long way. Still, perhaps, in case of accident, it would be best to get out of this. Helfer, if you can take this great chest, that's your business, you know." "Yes, Dad," said a third voice, "but you must help me get it on my back. It's awfully heavy, you know." "Well, it isn't just a bag of smoke, I admit. But you're as strong as a mountain, Helfer." "You say so, Dad." "I think myself I'm all right, but I could carry 10 times as much if it wasn't for my feet." That is your weak point, I confess, my boy. Isn't it yours too, father? Well, to be honest, it's a goblin weakness. Why they come so soft, I declare I haven't an idea. Especially when your head's so hard, you know, father. Yes, my boy, the goblin's glory is in his head. To think how the fellows up above there have put on helmets and things when they go fighting. Ugh, ha ha! But why don't we wear shoes like them, father? I should like it, especially when I've got a chest like that on my head. Well, you see, it's not the fashion. The king never wears shoes. The queen does. Yes, but that's for distinction. The first queen, you see, the king's first wife, wore shoes, of course, because she came from upstairs. And so, when she died, the next queen would not be inferior to her, and so she requested that she wear shoes too. It was all pride. She's the hardest in forbidding them to the rest of the women. I'm sure I wouldn't wear them. No, not that I wouldn't, said the first voice, which is evidently the mother of the family. I can't think why either of them should. Didn't I tell you the first queen was from upstairs, said the other. That's the only silly thing I ever knew His Majesty guilty of. Why should he marry an outlandish woman like that? One of our natural enemies, too. I suppose he fell in love with her. Poof! He was just as happy now with one of his own people. Did the queen die very soon? They didn't tease her to death, did they? So one of the sons asked. Oh, dear, no. The king worshipped her very footmarks. What made her die, then? Didn't the heir agree with her? She died when the young prince was born, someone answered. How silly of her. We'd never do that. It must have been because she wore shoes. I don't know that. Well, why do they wear shoes up there? Ah, now that's a sensible question, and I will answer it. But in order to do so, I must first tell you a secret. I once saw the queen's feet. Without her shoes? Yes, without her shoes. No. Did you? How was it? Never you mind how it was. She didn't know I saw them. And that's what do you think? They had toes. Toes? What's that? You may well ask. I should never have known if I had not seen the queen's feet. Just imagine. The ends of her feet were split up into 5 or 6 thin pieces. Oh, horrid! How could the king have fallen in love with her? You forget that she wore shoes. That's just why she wore them. That's why all the men, women too, upstairs wear shoes. They can't bear the sight of their own feet without them. Is that true? Ah, now I understand. If ever you wish for shoes again, Helfer, I'll hit your feet. I will. No, Mother, please don't. Then don't you. But with such a big box on my head, a hard scream followed, which Curdy interpreted as in reply to a blow from his mother upon the feet of her eldest goblin. Well, I never knew so much before, remarked a fourth voice. Your knowledge is not universal quite yet, said the father. You were only 50 last month. Mind you see into the bed and bedding. As soon as we've finished our supper, we'll be up and going. Ha, ha, ha. What are you laughing at, husband? I'm laughing to think what a mess the miners will find themselves in, somewhere before this day 10 years. What do you mean? Oh, nothing. Yes, you do mean something. You always mean something. It's more than you mean, then, wife. That may be, but it's not more than I find out, you know, she answered. Ha, you're a sharp one. What a mother you've got, Helfer. Yes, father. Well, I suppose I must tell you, said the father. They're all at the palace consulting about it tonight, and as soon as we've gotten away from this thin place, I'm going there to hear what they might fix upon. I should like to see that young ruffian on the other side, struggling in the agonies of... He dropped his voice so low that Curdy could only hear a growl. The growl went on in low bass for a good while, as inarticulate as if the goblin's tongue had been a sausage. And it was not until his wife spoke again that it rose to its former pitch. But what shall we do while you are at the palace? She asked. I will see you safe in the new house I've been digging for you for the last 2 months. Podge, you mind the table and chairs. I commit them to your care. The table has 7 legs. Each chair has 3. I shall require them all at your hands. After this arose a confused conversation about the various household goods and their transport, and Curdy heard nothing more than that was of any importance. He now knew at least one of the reasons the constant sound of the goblin hammers and pickaxes at night. They were making new houses for themselves, to which they might retreat when the miners should threaten to break into their dwellings. But he had learned 2 things of far greater importance. The first was that some grievous calamity was preparing, and almost ready to fall upon the heads of the miners. The second was that the weak point of a goblin's body, he had not known that their feet were so tender, as he had reason to suspect. He had heard it said that they had no toes, but he had never had the opportunity of inspecting them closely enough, and the dusk in which they always appeared, to satisfy himself whether it was a correct report. Indeed, Curdy had not even been able to satisfy himself as to whether they had no fingers. although that was also commonly said to be fact. One of the miners, indeed, who had much more schooling than the rest, was one to argue that such must have been the primordial condition of humanity, and that the education and handicraft had developed both toes and fingers, with which proposition Curdy had once heard his father sarcastically agree, alleging in support of it the probability that babies' gloves were a traditional remnant of the old state of things, while the stockings of all ages, no regard being paid to them into the toes, pointed in the same direction. But what was important was the fact concerning the softness of goblin feet, which he foresaw might be useful to all miners. What he had to do in the meantime, however, was to discover, if possible, the special evil design the goblins had now in their heads. Although he knew all the gangs and all the natural galleries in which they communicated in the mined part of the mountain, he had not the least idea where the palace of the king of the gnomes was. Otherwise, he would have set out at once on the enterprise of discovering what said plan was. He judged, and rightly, that it must lie in the farther part of the mountain, between which and the mine there was as yet no communication. There must be one nearly completed, however, for it could only be but a thin partition which now separated them. If he could get through in time to follow the goblins as they retreated, a few blows would doubtless be sufficient, just where his ear now lay. But if he attempted to strike there with his pickaxe, he would only hasten the departure of the family, put them on their guard, and perhaps lose their involuntary guidance. He therefore began to feel the wall with his hands, and soon found that some of the stones were loose enough to be drawn out with little noise. Laying hold of a large one in both his hands, he drew it gently out, and he laid it down softly. "What was that noise?" asked the goblin father. Curdy blew out his light, lest it should shine through. "It must be that one miner that stayed behind without the rest," said the mother. "No, he's been gone a good while. I haven't heard a blow for an hour. Besides, it wasn't like that." "Then I suppose it must have been a stone carried down the brook inside. Perhaps we will have more room by and by." Curdy kept quite still. After a little while, hearing nothing but the sounds of their preparations for departure, mingled with an occasional word of direction, and anxious to know whether the removal of stone had made an opening into the goblin's house, he put his hand to feel. It went in a good way, and then came in contact with something soft. He had but a moment to feel it over, it was so quickly withdrawn. It was one of the toeless goblin feet! The owner of it gave a cry of fright. "What's the matter, Helfer?" asked his mother. "A beast came out of the wall and licked my foot." "Nonsense, there are no wild beasts in our country," said his father. "But it was, father, I felt it," said Helfer. "Nonsense, I say. Will you malign your native realms and reduce them to a level with the country upstairs? That is swarming with wild beasts of every description." "But I did feel it, father. I tell you, hold your tongue. You are no patriot." Curdy suppressed his laughter and lay still as a mouse. But no stiller, for every moment he kept nibbling away with his fingers at the edges of the hole. He was slowly making it bigger, for here the rock had been very much shattered with the blasting. There seemed to be a good many in the family, to judge from the mass of confused talk which now and then came through the hole. But when all were speaking together, and just as if they had bottle brushes, each at least one, in their throats, it was not easy to make out much of what was said. At length he heard once more what the father goblin was saying. "Now then," he said, "get your bundles on your backs. Here, Helfer, I'll help you up with your chest." "I wish it was my chest, father." "Your turn will come in good time. Make haste. I must go to the meeting at the palace tonight. When that's over, we can come back and clear out the last of the things before our enemies return in the morning. Now, light your torches and come along. What a distinction it is to provide our own light instead of being dependent on a great thing hung up in the air. A most disagreeable contrivance." Guess they don't like the sun at all, huh? "Intended no doubt to blind us when we venture out under its baleful influence. Quite glaring and vulgar, I call it, though no doubt useful to the poor creatures who haven't the wit to make light for themselves." Curdy could hardly keep himself from calling through to know whether they had made the fire to light their torches by. But a moment's reflection showed him that they would have said they did, inasmuch as they struck 2 stones together, and the fire came. Stacy by firelight below the mines, huh? It's a little too dark. I like the sun. Don't you? Well, that was the end of Chapter 8. So join me tomorrow for Chapter 9, The Hall of the Goblin Palace. Thanks for reading with me. Have a fun day.